Hello and welcome to Introduction to Preaching, Week 1. We will be discussing in this lecture, what is good preaching on deliberate practice. One of the things that we will be trying to refine for ourselves and to name more concretely is what makes for good preaching or a good sermon or a good preacher. All of us are coming into this class with different assumptions about the criteria that make for good preaching and the criteria that make for bad preaching. And we all come from different places as well. And so one of the ways in which we're going to actually get even behind those assumptions is to speak to the practice of preaching. So one of the things that you maybe have heard it said from supervisors or others, even a preaching professor, because I think that I have erroneously said this in the past, is that what makes for good preaching is time. Just time. It takes practice, it takes years of experience, and once you hit about 5 or 10 years, you'll just find that your preaching is better. But I'm here to say to you that this is not necessarily the case. It's not necessarily the case in any sort of discipline or field or everyday practice like driving, that time makes you better at something. There's another ingredient that you have to add to time in order for you to become an expert in any sort of practice. And so that's why practice needs to not just be practice, but it needs to be deliberate. And what's great about this is that it really levels the playing field then. So that means that even if you are coming into this class and you are about to preach your very first sermon, you will be united with those who have been preaching for years, not just in meeting the 6 homiletical criteria that you will write about in your sermon reflection papers, but in making deliberate decisions, setting out on this practice of preaching with deliberate decisions as you undergo these moves through this class. Where together we become better at the practice of preaching by interrogating the assumptions that we have about what makes for good preaching or good preachers. We also become better when we question how those assumptions about what makes for a good sermon or a good preacher guide the actions that you take in your practice. You also can become an expert, whether you're at the beginning or you've been preaching for a long time, by listening to and learning from feedback. You also become better when you recognize limitations so that you can evaluate outcomes and then make necessary adjustments the next time you perform your skill or your practice. So I want this to be a level playing field, right? And I understand as I'm assessing all of you that you will be starting out from various levels. And this is why the course is scaffolded in the way that it is, where you have 3 opportunities to preach, where the first sermon is not given as much weight as the last sermon, and where I'm not just assessing your sermon manuscript in the sermon event, but your critique as well. It has been the case in the past where a really, really bad sermon with a very, very thoughtful and careful paper received a much better grade than the sermon alone warranted. And it has also been the case when a really awesome sermon with a reflection paper that shows no critical thought, but just embraces the awesomeness of the feedback they received, gets a lower grade than would have been handed out to just the sermon alone. So both of these pieces are important because in this class, I want you to be deliberate. I want you to pay attention so that you create a habit through these 15 weeks together that will carry forward into your preaching career, because practice alone in and of itself does not make perfect. This quote comes from Kay Anders Erickson and Robert Poole in their book, Peak, Secrets from the New Science of Expertise. They did research on people who are considered experts or in fields of violin and medicine and various places. And these are the things that they found. Quote, research has shown that generally speaking, once a person reaches that level of acceptable performance and automaticity, the additional years of practice don't lead to improvement. If anything, the doctor or the teacher or the driver who's been at it for 20 years is likely to be a bit worse than the one who's been doing it for only 5. And the reason is that these automated abilities gradually deteriorate in the absence of deliberate efforts to improve. So one of the things that you will learn in my lectures is that in order for me to really know that you have viewed them and paid attention to them, I embed questions that pop up, and there will be a forum where you need to respond to kind of show and prove to me that you are actually listening to this lecture right now. And so the first little Easter egg that I have hidden is this one, and I need you to respond to this quote from Erickson and Poole. Reflect on where you have seen this in your own life or in others that you work with or live with, where someone has reached that level of their performance being acceptable, and so then kind of entering into this automatic movement that freezes the improvement of their practice, be it driving or preaching or anything else. Please pause the video, go to the forum, and share some responses about how practice does not always by itself make perfect. All right, welcome back. So again, we want to resist in this class automaticity, okay? I don't want you to think you have arrived. I know that I have not arrived, and I have been preaching for 20 years and teaching preaching for almost 10. So we can always improve. We can always be deliberate and refine our skills. That's a very Wesleyan belief, is it not? Okay. So not in driving, not in art, not in music, common sense can be used to justify less than perfect preaching, and we don't want to do that in this class. So whether you've been at it for years or are preaching for the first time, we will all undergo that flow chart above in our preaching practice to be deliberate about our practice. And this is why the course is designed as it is. Most of your grade is determined not just by the sermon or a set of sermons, but you're also assessed on the critical reflection paper for each sermon. And that's also why the weights are what they are. And so we will be practicing deliberate practice throughout this course. This is what we will do. We will listen to and learn from feedback. You will demonstrate this in the lab, in the forum feedback section. You will also demonstrate to me, you'll demonstrate this in your reflection paper, that you are listening to feedback for one, meaning you actually quote and name feedback that you were given, and show me you're learning something from it. So you're not just shutting it down all the time, but that you're going, perhaps this means, or I should pay attention to in your reflection. You also need to, we will recognize limitations and name those limitations that we have, and seek feedback concretely in the lab when you know you have a limitation and you set a goal to improve it. You want to be honest and open about that limitation and name an outcome, set a goal for the next time around so that we can help you, help each other reach that goal. We're also finally then going to make necessary adjustments. You could preach the same sermon on the first unit, if you preached the exact same way in the third unit, you will get a worse grade in the third unit than you had in the first. If you made no changes, you don't show that you've learned or listened to anything given to you in this class. Making the same mistakes twice is a weighty decision, and it does not show that you are having deliberate practice in your homiletic work. So please be deliberate, authentic, open to critique, and make adjustments as we go along so that you can refine your practice and your skills in preaching. Even if your congregation thinks you're awesome, show them that you have even more potential they don't even know. Okay, so there are some exceptions in the practice of preaching that don't exist in like the practice of the medical practice or chiropractic or playing the violin or the piano, because there's something else going on in the practice of preaching. We'll talk about this something else next week when we talk about the theo-rhetorical nature of preaching. And that's that it's not just a practice that we do in and of ourselves. God, the Holy Spirit, is involved in this practice and in this speaking. This is why, as Samuel D. Proctor said in A Certain Sound of the Trumpet Crafting a Sermon of Authority, sometimes when that preacher gets up to preach, no matter how incoherent or incomplete the message might be, the life lived grants it a measure of authority that no skillful outline could ever give. So there are some times when you will hear a sermon that on paper makes zero sense or isn't very skillful or articulate, but because of the person saying it and the way they embody it and the life that they live, it will move you, it will shake you, and it will preach the gospel to you. And this is why we don't just assess the manuscript, right? Because the sermon, the preaching, it's a living event. One of the gifts of you all being in the hybrid class is that you don't get to give me the excuse of, oh, when I preach this in my church, it's totally different, because you are recording yourself preaching in a church. You are recording the event that is embedded in the liturgy. And so there is something that is rich and deep about that experience that you don't always get in the lab environment that you'll have focus week. But there is something to the lab environment too that is distinct from the congregational environment, where you can probably take more risks than you can in your congregation. So you get to do both in this class, and isn't that a wonderful thing? So a lot of what I'm saying about deliberate practice comes from my colleague Jared Alcantara's work. What does playing the violin have to do with preaching sermons? The implications of deliberate practice on preaching. And so Alcantara recognizes that when it comes to preaching, again, there's something exceptional, separating it from ballet or soccer. It's a work of communication that is human, and it's a work of communication that is divine. And so the preacher is never the only speaker. God is both speaking and is the subject matter of our sermons. It's a theo-rhetorical practice, not just a rhetorical speech trying to persuade someone. There is a living theological moment that is happening. And so that's how it can be that even when a preacher has severe limitations, perhaps, because of the love that they show for God and for people, the sermon can have authority, it can move us, it can stir us in ways that a skillful outline by someone who does not walk the walk of love and God cannot deliver. And so another aspect of this class that we will talk about is our lives, our spiritual lives, our embodied lives, the whole of ourselves, and how it too can benefit from us being deliberate in our practice of life. So all of us making sure that we are supported by spiritual disciplines and physical exercises and movements and practices that make us better preachers, not just in the script, but in the sermon that we live out without saying a word every day that we move about in God's beautiful and broken world. I want to close here by lifting up these 4 class commitments that I hope we can all get on board with. And again, these are named by my colleague Alcantara in Deliberate Practice. Number 1, let us commit to setting concrete goals. So this will start after you've preached perhaps your first sermon and received your first round of feedback. Name one concrete goal and that first reflection paper that you have for the second sermon. And keep that practice alive. Set concrete goals every week in your preaching, and you will become a better preacher and homiletician. Number 2, during this time together, let's improve our focused attention. I have been a pastor. I have been a solo pastor that's part-time and still had to preach every single week, along with having another job. And focused attention on the tasks of preaching are competing with a million other things. But in this time together, in these 15 weeks together, let's commit to improving our focused attention to the tasks of exegesis, to the practice and the discipline of Lectio Divina and prayerfully engaging the scriptures, our focused attention to our bodies and how we are feeling and how we are expressing the words that are coming out of our mouths in the preaching event. Pay attention, slow down, make a commitment to improving that, and you are sure to improve your preaching and just your life. The third class commitment, learn from constructive feedback. Don't fight it, don't ignore it, don't deny it, but learn from it. Please commit to that in this class and it will go well for you. And of course, related to that is the word constructive feedback. We also are all giving feedback, so we commit to feedback that is not just destructive and destroys the person of the preacher, the character, the beliefs of a preacher, but that is constructive and builds up and helps to name a weakness or name an issue, but then to suggest solutions as well. Finally, the last class commitment that I will encourage here is that you will take risks. I know that this is going to be a challenge in the hybrid class in particular, because 2 of your sermons are still in the context of a congregation where you don't always have the leeway to take risks. But I will note that you do have 1 sermon in the lab at St. Paul's School of Theology where you can take risks that you may not be able to take during those other 2 sermons. So I encourage you to set a goal, to take a risk, whether it's to preach without notes for the first time, or it's to name more concretely prophetic things that you see going on that you would be afraid to name at this point in your context. Or to become a character who's preaching a sermon from the first person. I hope that you will commit during our 15 weeks together to taking risks. Because again, even if it's a flop in the sermon, the learnings that you share and the reflection can still show that you are being deliberate and you are improving, and we will celebrate that as a class together. All right. So these are our 4 class commitments. that we have, we are aiming at not just being practitioners of preaching, but being deliberate and careful. We come into this time together knowing and naming that all of us have areas to improve upon, and that no one really ever becomes an expert at preaching, just as no one ever really masters divinity, because there is always mystery and one greater than us who is pulling and pushing us forward into more beautiful, loving, and just ways of being and of preaching. Okay, so at this point, after this first introductory lecture, please do make sure, if you haven't already, that you go ahead and listen to our very first sermon from Reverend Dr. Valerie Bridgman that is up on Moodle, and go to the forum and respond to the prompts there. Also, do make sure that you have watched the video on walking through the syllabus, and so that you are sure to tend to attendance and all of those other pieces and ask questions now that you may have. And finally, make sure you do your very first workbook exercise as well and share that. So there are many moving pieces. It will become a habit for you as we move on. And as always, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. And until then, see you next week when we discover and discuss more about the theorhetorical nature of preaching.